Hello, hello. It is February. We've got Black History Month, we've got Valentine's Day and romances to be read, and it's a leap year, which means we get an extra day of reading. Also, we have a setup where I have a little table in front of me, so my hands are slightly higher than usual, which means that they may be peeking into the frame a little bit more because I talk with my hands, but try to keep that distraction down generally. But we have a lot to talk about today because, of course, we have a new month of new releases to dive into. And with February, we are officially out of the holiday season. We're ramping back up and we have approximately over 30 titles that I want to highlight today. Now, this month is actually pretty exciting. So I'm hoping that enthusiasm translates and that it pays off in terms of some great reads this month because I have a number of these books already on hold at the library. If there are any titles coming out this month that I don't highlight here that you're excited about, as always, please feel free to talk about them in the comment section, as well as any books talked about today that you're also excited about and just want to share that excitement. I also think, as usual, probably, that we have a generally pretty good variety here. We've got some returning authors that I have personally loved, maybe you have loved as well, some new to me authors, as well as some authors that I'm familiar with, or some of these titles are a nice kick in the butt to remind me that I have previous books on my shelves, or if I haven't finished a series, or what have you. But with that being said, let's jump right into it and discuss February 6th releases, especially because as of this posting, that is tomorrow. And we are starting with a fan favorite. We have a new book from Ali Hazelwood. Now, we got a new book from Ali Hazelwood this fall. I am still behind and have not read it yet. That book was her first foray into young adult fiction, young adult romance. This title is still an adult romance, but is a much different vein than we've seen from her so far, and it is Bride by the aforementioned Ali Hazelwood. This is a supernatural romance, and it is following the heir of a vampire dynasty. I believe vampire may be spelled with a Y here, who is entering into a marriage of convenience. We know how I feel about a marriage of convenience. Maybe. I like it if you don't know. Into a marriage of convenience with a werewolf, the head of a werewolf clan of sorts. This is giving me a little bit of the vibe of the paranormal romance I read as a teenager and early adult. Think your like Sookie Stackhouse type books. I don't know that it's going to be living completely in that vein, but feels reminiscent. And it feels like we are kind of moving into that direction in a lot of different ways because I feel like I am seeing more vampires popping back up. So it seems like that resurgence that was seeded a couple of years ago really is coming to fruition here. But I'm excited to see something new, like I said, from Hazelwood. I finally did complete her Steminist, not the novellas, I'd already read those, all of the novels, and I will talk about that more in my January wrap-up because I read the last one I needed to read in January. But I'm very interested to see her right outside of that world. I know I can swing back to the young adult, but that still feels very similar thematically in some ways. So I'm excited to see her deviate, especially because her books are so easy to read, or for me, I have listened to most of them because they are easy listens. I will say some of the things that I personally struggle with Hazelwood, primarily her focus on a very large hero and a very small petite heroine, which I understand is a preference for a lot of readers or is something a lot of readers enjoy, and you are allowed to enjoy that. I'm not saying you're not. I just find it kind of repetitive and the focus on it, which I do think she's tried to pull back from a little bit, especially in comparison to the novellas again. I admittedly find it hard sometimes, and I'm only bringing this up again because the paranormal realm kind of leans in these directions already sometimes, so I will be interested to see how she writes that in this genre. I'm not saying she has to leave it behind completely. I'm not saying it existing is going to be a complete deterrent for me by any means, but the way it was written sometimes felt a little forced, and maybe this subgenre will allow that to be explored a little bit more within the kind of rules of the subgenre in a more natural, organic way, and still kind of fill that void for some readers while not feeling as obvious or disjointed to me as a reader. I don't know. I don't know if I'm making my point, and I don't want to mislead because I am excited for this, especially because it seems to be a harbinger of sorts of a real return to supernatural paranormal romances. And I know that they have not fallen away completely. I know people have still been writing them. They just haven't been as prominent in the mainstream conversations. So just excited to see that in the forefront a little bit more. And with that, we're gonna move it along because I already know I'm going to talk more than I probably should in this video. We are moving to one of the examples of a series I desperately need to finish, and honestly meant to finish in January, and that did not happen. And that is the Celestial Kingdom duology from Su Lin Tan, starting with Daughter of the Moon Goddess. Although you're like, Melody, it's a duology, we have 2 books. How is that relevant here? We are getting in February Tales of the Celestial Kingdom, which is a short story collection taking place in this world, some before the book, some after, some in between, to my understanding. It does say 2 of these stories are previously published, which is a great example of why I need something like this compiled, because even though I have enjoyed Daughter of the Moon Goddess, it was one of my favorite books of, was it 2022? I think so. I have not read these short stories, and maybe I've come across them and have just forgotten because I didn't want to read them until I had finished the duology, but I clearly not read them. So I'm excited to see what this is, how I respond to it. I assume some of my response will be determined slightly by how I respond to Heart of the Sun Warrior, but this will also hopefully then help me prioritize that. In terms of things that need to be prioritized, next we have A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. This is relevant because I may be the one person in the world at this point who hasn't read 7 Days in June, despite owning it in 2 formats. So I really need to get to that, but I have heard that it is very heart-wrenching and emotional, so I have just been trying to balance when that is going to work for me. And this I am so intrigued by, even outside of the passionate response of 7 Days in June, that makes me interested in what this author is writing. First, look at the cover. This is like peak contemporary romance cover in terms of that kind of crossover for popular fiction, especially, which I feel like this author and these books so far, from what I've heard, secondhand admittedly, really fit into, and I am so excited by this cover. And I'm also excited by the insides of this. Do not worry, we are following our protagonist, Ricky Wilde, who is the daughter of a very prominent family in Atlanta, and she is feeling kind of lost. She is the artistic daughter. She doesn't really know where she fits or what she wants to do, presumably. And then she is offered to rent an apartment in Harlem from what I assume is either a family friend or a family member. And there she meets a mysterious, handsome gentleman. Now, we love a mysterious, handsome gentleman in and of themselves. But I am also intrigued by this, and if this is too much sleuthing and deduction for you and you feel like it's going to spoil something in the book, skip ahead. But the blurb mentions modern Harlem and Renaissance glamour. Renaissance is capitalized. We are in Harlem. There is a tag on this book in Goodreads for magical realism. I have made conclusions from that for myself. You can make whatever conclusions you want from that, but I am very intrigued, especially as this mysterious handsome stranger is not named in the blurb. And yeah, I just have a lot of questions. I'm very excited. And once again, look at that cover. Then we have Infinity Alchemist by Kaysen Callender, which is a young adult fantasy following, probably not surprisingly, young alchemists. But in this world, only a select few are permitted to study magic and presumably alchemy as a higher form of magic, and our protagonist Ash has not been granted this permission. But instead of giving up, he decides to get a job as the groundskeeper at the Magic College and study magic in secret. However, he is probably expectedly found out by one of the students, apprentices, and the student blackmails our protagonist Ash that he will keep this secret if Ash helps him find this mysterious magic book, the Book of Source. And so they set out on this quest where there is a clash of personalities personalities, but ultimately feelings become more complicated and different kinds of feelings may develop. So I am very excited to see what this is. I have not read any of Calendar's work since Felix Ever After, so I definitely need to rectify that. I know there was an adult romance that I was interested in last year that I need to circle back to as well, but I love a magic school. I think magic schools are another trend that we are seeing in terms of there is an interest there. I am definitely interested, so I'm not talking down to the trends by any means, but it's something I'm keeping track of for myself. And I like the twist here that our protagonist isn't part of the magic school, that he is on the outskirts of this world. So I'm excited to see how that is played with in the narrative. And then we have 50 Beasts to Break Your Heart and Other Stories by Jenna Rose Nethercott. This is my reminder to myself, my accountability to myself, that I still have a copy of Thistlefoot sitting on my shelf behind me. But this is a short story collection that seems to dive into, according to the blurb, the kind of magical fairy tale-esque realms similar to what we purportedly get in Thistlefoot, because again, it's sitting on my TBR, but I love things that kind of bleed into these worlds of fairy tale and fantasy and magic and the odd in short stories, as you probably know. And this book, in terms of how it's being described in the blurb, makes me think of one of my favorite short story collections, Get in Trouble by Kelly Link. Don't worry, we will be coming back to Kelly Link this month, but I'm very interested in this collection because of that, and so we'll see what we get here. And then we have The Duke's All That by Christina Britton, which is the third in a romance series that I admittedly have not read the first two in, but am intrigued by going back and looking into those titles as well. But this is a second chance romance. I can't find any evidence that it is connected to She's All That, but nonetheless, it is following a duke who for the last 13 years has believed his wife was dead, and then he finds out that she has been living on this island. So he goes to retrieve her in order to be granted a divorce and to get a little bit of retribution and revenge, presumably at least emotional revenge. There is surely some history and some feelings to unpack there, but supposedly feelings and history on both sides. And I think this is a case probably of a lot of miscommunication and this idea that both of them had abandoned the relationship in some way according to the other or to the other's thought. So very excited. It does make me think of Sarah MacLean a little bit. I believe The Day of the Duchess is the book that she has that's revolving around a couple seeking a divorce or a heroine that's coming back seeking a divorce. And because of that, because there's all this weight and this history in this relationship, it is going to be presumably higher angst. At least I know The Day of the Duchess is a higher angst book. That may just be MacLean as well. So I'm interested to see what spin on that we get here. Additionally, it does talk about how she's been living on an island, so presumably there's a community there, and the series is titled The Sinful Spinsters, so maybe there's a connection there. I do love and am interested in a good spinster narrative, very much a cousin or a sister to the Wallflower, so surely something that we will be circling back to this year with Bridgerton Season 3 coming out. And then we have An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson, most notably known as the author of A Dowry in Blood, which I have not read yet. Let me know if you think I should, but this seems potentially a little bit more closely related to the concept of that book than it may first appear, because at first glance, this appears to be a pretty straightforward, though still intriguing, dark academia novel with a complex, maybe codependent female friendship, a teacher who is maybe a little bit more sinister, magic, or some kind of darkness looming at this place. But this compelling friend that our protagonist Laura has, her name is Carmilla, and I am probably pronouncing that wrong in relation to the French, and I am sorry, but as someone who went through a vampire phase and read a lot of classics when I first got my first Kindle in college because they were all free at the time, basically. And it is not a literary name that I run into a whole lot. And within this kind of context, it definitely sets off my spidey senses. So I am very intrigued to see where this goes. I am going to make a giant leap and presume we will also be getting vampires of some kind in this book. So then combined with that idea of dark academia, very excited. So in some ways, this feels like, and again, I haven't read it yet, but I would say if you liked House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson, which of course you did because it was written by Alexis Henderson and it was fantastic, then this will probably be something you want to check out as well. If nothing else, while you're waiting for the next Alexis Henderson, which I do think we're getting this year. But nonetheless, very excited to see what this is about. And then if I like it, maybe I will swing back to A Dowry in Blood as well. I got so caught up in the moment, I forgot to mention that that comes out February 13th, which means we've finally made it to the next release week in February and continuing into the next release week in February, i.e. February 13th, not skipping ahead another week. We are getting the Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. I believe this is a debut. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this feels like it's going to be one of those fantasies for readers, and that is following a bookseller who has gotten this mysterious book that opens doors. So it bestows power. And while our protagonist Cassie and her friend Izzy are swept up in this power and this adventure, we know with great power comes great responsibility, and this is more complicated than it may first appear. And we have the appearance of Drummond Fox, who is fleeing his own demons, according to the blurb, and knows that some doors should remain closed. So I'm very interested to know what the world of this is going to look like, if it's going to be very similar in terms of the magic system to the 10,000 Doors of January. I'm also getting a little bit of the Starless Sea from the blurb. Maybe if I had read the Midnight Library, that would feel kind of in line as well. I don't know, but ultimately I also don't know because I haven't read it, so we'll see what we get here. And then let's swing back to Kelly Link, shall we? Because we are getting the Book of Love from Kelly Link, which is her first, to my knowledge, novel. And this looks like it's going to be quite the chunker, which kind of fits because last year we got the first English translation of Mariana Enriquez, who is one of my favorite short story authors, and her first novel was a chunker. So Kelly Link, who is also one of my favorite short story authors, though I will admit that last year's collection I am kind of struggling through, we're going to get kind of a chunker here again. But it follows a group of teenagers who have been missing and presumed dead for years. And according to the blurb, they were dead, and they find themselves in their old music room of their high school with their music teacher, who basically gives them a mission, a quest to regain their old lives. And this mission, this quest, involves magical tasks. Now, what I love about Kelly Link short stories is that blending of the real and the fantastical in really delicious ways. And so I'm very anxious to see how that's going to translate here, because I think it will, and not just because my mind is correlating the music room of it, because I read Get in Trouble partially while substitute teaching in a band choir class. That's neither here nor there. That's just my own association. But based on her work and based on this length, I'm assuming the world is going to get much bigger, especially than we've seen in these short stories, because the short stories are usually a little bit more contained, even though we feel the larger world. So getting to kind of push against the bounds of what we explore in her short stories is going to be very interesting. I think it's likely there will be a mixed reaction to this book. It looks like the reviews, at least on Goodreads, are already kind of mixed because Link's writing does require a little bit more attention. It's a little denser. It's easier to get lost in it. And sometimes I will admit that even I lose patience with it, in the sense that even this most recent short story collection, I've had trouble wading through some of it. However, when it works for me, it works for me. It is some of the best, most lyrical, lovely, lush writing. And so I am so eager to see how that's going to work here. And I'm sure we will probably talk more about this book, unless it's such a disappointment that I never want to think about it again, but I doubt that's going to be the case. So this is a highly, highly anticipated release for me, and I am excited to see what we're going to get here. And in a similar vein of highly anticipated releases, we have The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. Now, initially, you might be like, Melody, I've seen this book floating around. It's a World War I narrative. You said you don't really like World War narratives. What gives? A couple of things. One, it's written by Catherine Arden, who most notably wrote The Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, which is still one of my favorites. I need to revisit it. It's been so long since I read it, but that series is just beautiful. If you have not read for some reason, because I'm sure it has been talked about all over the bookish internet when it first came out. I was a bookseller at the time, so I wasn't as clued in to places like YouTube at the time, but I'm sure it's been talked about a lot. If for some reason you haven't read it, go ahead and read it. However, this is a pretty significant deviation, and because of that, I do want to acknowledge the style is probably going to be pretty different as well, because in the Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, we're kind of mimicking the fairy tale-esque styling. We are much slower. We're living in that kind of slow speed of life, the kind of cold. It's very evocative in that way. And here we're looking at World War I. We're looking at the kind of start of the modern age, as well as that disillusionment that came from World War I and the kind of shattering of perceptions of the world, which I think it's very notable that it seems like World War I in particular, I'm starting to notice, and maybe it's just kind of creeping more into books I'm interested in terms of that kind of crossover of kind of a supernatural speculative angle, but being interested in that disillusionment, this idea that the world doesn't operate the way we hoped or the way we thought it would or whatnot. And so here I'm drawn to Arden as an author, but also the idea of how World War I is going to be explored here, especially because the blurb mentions like rumors of haunted trenches, but also this idea that men who have escaped the horrors of war may be falling prey to something else directly from the blurb. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons, both thematically exploring that, but also because the blurb talks about our protagonist looking for her lost brother in 1918, but it also talks about her brother in 1917, which leads me to believe we are going to be flipping between these dual timeline narratives. And so we're going to be watching her seeking answers as we, as the reader, are seeing things kind of pieced together in the historical timeline. And I think the historical being 1 year before, but I think that that is a really interesting narrative opportunity in terms of kind of utilizing point of view and using the reader in terms of what we as readers know or don't know. And based on Arden's skill with the Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, I really trust her to maneuver that in a really interesting, complex, successful way. So I'm excited about the author. I'm excited about the narrative kind of construction, and I'm excited about the idea of more literal ghosts where we definitely have the metaphorical ghosts in our history. So interested to see where the speculative or the supernatural bleed into the narrative, because I think they will, because we get that hinted at, one, in the listing on Goodreads, but two, the kind of subtle ways that works in the Bear and the Nightingale, and then seeing that translated to a more modern setting. Very intrigued. And then we have The Foxwife by Yangzi Chu. I have not yet read The Night Tiger, although I believe it is her most popular book. I've checked it out many times and it's just sat on the stack, not because I don't want to read it, but because I have a problem prioritizing backlists sometimes, or like stack, it's a personal problem. But Yangzi Chu also wrote The Ghost Bride, which I do know is a Netflix movie that I haven't watched yet, but it is also my favorite Barnes & Noble Discover New Writers pick I have ever picked up. It's the perfect kind of blend of that supernatural and that gothic and that historical, and I think in a lot of ways it was way ahead of its time, and so I am just so excited to continue, and I will definitely prioritize this release and maybe swing back for The Night Tiger as well, because I love these kinds of worlds. And here we are exploring the kind of mythology of the Fox Maiden, which I personally as a reader have come across a lot in relation to Korean fiction, and this seems to be following two kind of plot lines. One with a detective trying to get to the bottom of a woman who has turned up dead in the cold, and the kind of superstition and belief that she is or was or a victim of the Fox Maidens in some way. And then the other plot line is following a family whose sons are cursed to die before they turn 24, and their eldest son is currently 23, and then their luck shifts when a new woman enters the household. And so these are presumably linked. I think based on the title and the kind of emphasis in the blurb, we can guess how those may be linked, but I'm sure there's going to be twists and this kind of emphasis on the supernatural, and here the kind of realms of gods and folk tales. And so I'm excited to see how this blends together. I will say, having a book named The Ghost Bride and having a book named The Foxwife is interesting in the same way that we had that whole conversation about like girl in the title of everything at the kind of height of the thriller girl on the train era, which again is marketing, but this kind of framing of these characters as the object of someone in some ways or in relation to someone else, which I am not speaking down of in this moment because I think that is incredibly purposeful in relation to these stories, but just something to think about going into this one potentially. And then we have At First Sight by Olivia Dade, the start of a new series from the author of, spoiler alert, and All the Feels and Shipwrecked, which I still need to read, which I absolutely adored. So I am excited to see where this one goes. I admittedly am going to be a little bit sad to leave the world and realm of fandom and the show in that series behind, though clearly I will not be leaving it fully behind anytime soon because I still need to finish it. But this is following a protagonist who is forced to live in a spite house after a broken engagement, and it is a one of those small, thin little houses. But the twist is it's right in between her ex-fiance and his brother, who was the one that presumably, I believe, caused the end of this engagement. And so she decides to make his life as awful as he has presumably made hers, whether that means playing loud, smutty audiobooks at night or whatever. However, things are complicated, not only by presumably feelings, as they always are, but the fact that he's being so nice to her. So I will be interested to see what world this opens for us from this new Dade and just what kind of spark we have here. I'm sure there will also be some extra depth that we're not anticipating, because especially in, spoiler alert, and All the Feels, she manages to explore some emotional complexity and nuance with real compassion amidst something that is much more of a rom-com in feel and structure. So definitely interested to see how this translates to a new world. And then we have Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear by Robin Wassley, which is comped in the blurb as for fans of Buffy and the Raven Boys, both things I am fans of and have comped things to recently, but also notably The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness, which I had forgotten just how much I enjoyed that book when it came out and would highly encourage you to read it if you have not. And if we're going to continue with the Buffy framing, The Rest of Us Just Live Here is very much the Zeppo kind of amped up. And so here we're in a similar vein where this is a magical community where the kind of realm, the rift between the supernatural and the real are being guarded by, I think, guardians, quite literally. And while this kind of magical convergence is an attraction for outsiders, for tourists, our protagonist is just trying to get through her day-to-day. She's recently had a friendship breakup of sorts because her friends started dating each other and just feeling completely awkward in her adolescence. So when the seal is essentially broken, she does not have time for the essentially zombie apocalypse that results until she finds out that her missing brother is involved with the Guardians. And then things become even more complicated than a zombie apocalypse. So in a world of chosen ones, which I admittedly do enjoy, I also really enjoy the subversion that is the mundane, everyday person that is kind of roped in to the apocalypse in whatever way. Now, this is a kind of hard line to walk because at a certain point, does your protagonist become a chosen one? But I think there's a tone there and a kind of irreverence, I would say. So very excited, especially again, after seeing that comp to The Rest of Us Just Live Here. And then speaking of thresholds, barriers, guardians of sorts, we then have The Briar Book of the Dead by A.G. Slater, which again is another author whose book I have on my TBR and I need to revisit. Notably, I own All the Murmuring Bones and need to get to it, especially as presumably this book does take place in the same world, though I do believe it's a standalone fantasy, and it involves a community run by witches, which is not usual, but these witches protect this community from the leeches, the vampires, I believe. So we again are seeing some vampires, but we don't have a novel if that stasis is maintained. So things are upset. New forces come into play. Ancient mysteries are involved, according to the blurb. So interested to see what this looks like, and is just a reminder for myself as well, again, to get to All the Murmuring Bones. And then lastly, for the 13th, we have another short story collection, Bugsy and Other Stories by Raphael Frumkin. I just read Raphael Frumkin's Confidence, confidence and really enjoyed it. So I'm interested to see that same kind of irreverent tone and this kind of exploration of modern mores and the kind of social agreements explored in this book, because the blurb does say that this collection is a celebration of social taboos, and based on the way things were framed in confidence, I am really interested to see how the stories in this operate, how they're framed. I expect a certain kind of irreverent tone, and I'm really looking forward to that. And with that, let's move into February 20th. We are starting with the new Lorraine Heath in Want of a Viscount, which follows an American not heiress as previously discussed, and Lorraine Heath was previously discussed in that video as well, but an American businesswoman of sorts who is seeking an investor for her family business. And in this search and coming overseas, she ends up spending a night at this ladies' club where she kisses a mysterious stranger. And presumably this stranger has something to do with Viscount Wyeth or Rook, and Rook has kind of vowed to live a life above reproach, but our heroine Lenora is kind of testing that. And then they are potentially discovered in a compromising position, and this could upset things for both of them. Rook's reputation, Lenora's ability to get an investor, but what I'm betting is that feelings become involved, somehow complicate things and or fix things, probably both. And we'll see how we get to that happily ever after. And then we have A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal, who is the author of We Hunt the Flame, which in and of itself is a reason I'm excited for this book. And then this is also being blurbed for fans of Six of Crows because there is a heist angle, but not just a heist angle, also a vampire angle. Again, vampires, it's gonna be the year for vampires, I think. Well, the year for vampires since I was a teenager. So this follows a criminal mastermind, Arthi, whose tea room at night caters to vampires, but when her business is threatened, she has to put together a crew and infiltrate the upper echelons of vampire society. However, not everyone on her crew may be loyal to her. So I am so excited for this one. I anticipate we will probably talk more about this as well, but I'm excited for the heist, the ensemble, the vampires, and especially Faisal's voice again, because I really enjoyed the We Hunt the Flame duology. I should revisit that at some point. I should revisit it a lot at some point, but we'll see what we get here as a follow-up. And then we are getting The Bad Ones by Melissa Albert, which seems to live on the kind of precipice of a bunch of different genres that are very exciting. And this is set in a small town where over the course of one night, 4 people have mysteriously vanished. And one of those 4 people is our protagonist, Nora's best friend. And so in Nora trying to get to the bottom of where her best friend is, she uncovers secrets of her town's past, discovers coded messages, and supposedly folklore may be more linked to this disappearance than initially apparent. So it feels like it's going to have that kind of murder mystery angle, very much maybe in the realm of like the Maureen Johnson series, but also still in that supernatural kind of fantasy-esque realm. So gritty, true crime adjacent, but with a twist. And I am definitely always interested in the twist. And then we have Island Witch by Amanda J. Atisa, which is billed as gothic horror. Can we guess why I am interested? It takes place in 19th century Sri Lanka, and our protagonist's father is a demon priest, but because of colonialism and the religious practices brought with colonialism, he is no longer revered by his community, and instead they are suspicious of him and his practices, though they will still call on him when there's a disturbance. However, things have gone beyond disturbance, and men are being seized in the jungle, and instead of turning to the demon priest for answers, they are turning on him as the reason these things are happening. And in trying to clear her father's name, our protagonist Amara starts having dreams that eerily predict or are aware of some of these disturbances and what's going on or what's going to happen. The blurb specifically calls out the ideas of moral panic and female rage and this kind of in-between of girlhood and adulthood. And so while vastly different, I think that if you are interested in the narratives around the Salem witch trials, you may be interested in this, or at least that's what I think is kind of pulling me to this. And I will caveat that with the idea of colonialism surely being explored so actively in this book, and the idea of the Salem witch trials in particular being so enmeshed in the idea of colonialism, though of course those are not the only witch trials that we have seen throughout history. So there may be a bridge there thematically, but I don't want to whitewash this history that is being so specifically claimed and kind of examining the ideas of colonialism and the impacts of colonialism within the narrative itself on top of that claiming of the history. But I think that if you're interested in similar themes, you may be interested in this because, again, I'm interested in this. Then we have Remedial Magic by Melissa Marr, which seems to be her entry into like a cozier fantasy. It definitely appears to have a sapphic angle to it, and according to the blurb, it's following an unassuming librarian who has fallen in love with a powerful witch, discovered that she is a witch, and has to go to magical community college. So there's more going on there, but I am intrigued by the magical community college angle, the kind of cozier side of things, as well as I've kind of fallen off on Melissa Marr, and you've heard me talk about Melissa Marr before because the Wicked Lovely series was one of my teen entries into the realms of the Fae, and I had followed her work past that as an early adult, but I have definitely fallen off in maybe even the last decade. And I know she's constantly reinvented her voice and kind of met the trends of the moment, which I don't mean in a condescending way at all. So I'm interested to see what this looks like because I do think I potentially fell off because I didn't love the last title I read from her, but there's also so much history for me as a reader there that I'm definitely interested in circling back to that. And then we have The Diablo's Curse by Gabe Cole-Novoa, and yes, we did just get a release from Gabe Cole-Novoa last month. However, that was part of the kind of classic reimagining series, so I imagine that book had probably been done for a bit and was part of a very strict release schedule in relation to what I assume were commission titles to whatever degree. This is a spin-off, I believe, of The Wicked Bargain. I don't think you have to read The Wicked Bargain to read this one, though you should because it's a lot of fun. This is following a demon Dammy who is trying to undo all of the soul bargains they've made in order to become human again. And Dammy is down to just Silas standing between them and humanity, basically. However, this bargain is the only thing keeping Silas alive because he has been cursed to die young. Silas is cute. I think things become, as usual, more complicated. So they're trying to find a solution that will allow Dammy to have their humanity while not condemning Silas to death. And to those ends, they have to work together to break Silas's curse. And then we have Hours by Philip B. Williams, which I am incredibly intrigued by. I think this is going to be a book that a lot of people are talking about this year, based on the blurb and based on the kind of scope of things as established here, this bleeding of historical fiction and speculative fiction with this real literary bend. I am very excited to see what we get here. It also seems pretty ambitious in terms of length. I believe it's just shy of 600 pages. So when they say an epic novel in the blurb, they aren't kidding. But this novel starts in the 1830s and follows Saint, a conjurer who uses her power to annihilate plantations across America and rescue the people enslaved there. She then brings these people to a community north of St. Louis called Hours that is protected from the outside world through presumably the magic there. And then this novel follows the next, it says 40 years, and looks at the idea of community and isolation and where Saint's power starts to break a little bit and how outside forces start to infiltrate this community. So I am sure it is looking at this kind of speculative view of the Reconstruction era, and particularly Black communities around Reconstruction. It makes me think of Conjure Women in some ways, though not on the same scope level, but it also makes me think of things like The Survivalists and The New Naturals, which are looking at this idea of both surviving but also utopias, and this idea of kind of cults developing, at least in the modern era. I don't think here we are going to explore the kind of breakdown of utopia into cult. Maybe we will, but I'm anticipating a supernatural kind of metaphorical commentary on that history. What especially really intrigues me about the blurb, let me go ahead and read this. It says, a rich tradition of American literature informed by Black surrealism, mythology, and spirituality. I'm especially intrigued by that idea of surrealism. Reading this in the blurb and thinking about surrealism in relation to literature, I realize that I am probably drawn to things that fall into that category without ever really contemplating surrealism in literature that specifically, and that shows where I have explored surrealism in like theater and different forms of art, but hadn't really taken that step to use it to explain or explore my own reading. So I'm going to be very interested in that, and I'm definitely going to be interested in the discussions that come out of this book that I'm already anticipating, especially in relation to discussing Black surrealism in particular. Actually, now that I think about it, another book this makes me think of is Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. Definitely, I'm sure, exploring that idea of this community from a much different angle, but still, it's kind of title word association. So anyway, I'm very interested to see what the reception, what the conversation around this is going to be. Again, it is a very ambitious novel in terms of size, just based on the page listing, and I will be interested to see how that translates into the form of the thing, because I have not seen the book, so I don't know what it looks like on the page. Is it a dense, heavy prose? Is it more lyrical? Are they long chapters? Are they more staccato chapters? Do we jump around? What is the form, basically? So I definitely have my eyes on this. I'm very intrigued, but very interested to hear thoughts. If you have thoughts about this, let me know. And then maybe you're still in the kind of Buccaneers, Edith Wharton mindset, or you have been very deep into internet drama, but really need to remove yourself from that immediacy and are starting to get kind of stressed out by it and need some distance, but you still want the drama. So let's go back to some Gilded Age drama with Strong Passions, A Scandalous Divorce in Old New York by Barbara Weisberg. This is following a very prominent and scandalous divorce case in the 1860s, I believe, with the upper echelons of New York society, so very much something that would have been tabloid fodder at the time and would probably be tabloid fodder in its equivalent today, and so it does feed in to that gossip. However, a lot of gossip really does tap in to kind of social tensions at the time and mores and these real trends on a larger scale in how we kind of conceptualize ourselves and the social contract. That sounds way more pretentious than I meant it to be. I really just mean to say that this is also going to kind of explore the kind of tensions coming out of this time, kind of transition and tension over women's changing roles, which honestly, I feel like we are still seeing rehashed today in this kind of reactionary movement we are seeing in relation to like trad wife content and how it's romanticizing the very things that especially second wave feminism, I want to say, if I have my waves right, we're fighting for. There's the romanticization without the acknowledgement of what the reality of when things go bad looks like and the reality that things go bad more than they should. All right, with that, we are to February 27th and the last new release Tuesday of the month. So just hang with me a little longer. We are starting the week with Lore of the Wilds by Annalise Sabrana. This is a fairy tale-esque romance, fantasy romance, and we have 3 people on the cover, and I anticipate 3 people may be involved in this romance. It's got a magical library, it's got deals with the fae, it's got protectors and lovers we maybe can or cannot trust because they are the fae, so I am very excited about this. Also, look at that cover. It's fabulous. Also, I want to be clear that my presumption there is presumption, not knowledge, just in case. Because I read a book last year that I thought we'd see a little bit more fruition there than we did. Though we still have hope because the sequel comes out this year. But our protagonist, Lore, lives in a village that is isolated by the Fae. She makes a deal with the Fae Lord that she will go to try and catalog this mystical library that no one has had access to for a long time because the Fae can't get in. I don't quite know yet. However, she's really seeking power of her own. The world outside is a little bit more dangerous than she anticipated, and this is where these 2 other Fae come into the picture in that she needs them for protection, but there's also some additional chemistry there. So if you are in your romantasy era, I think this is a book you're going to want to check out. And then to switch it up, I don't want to say on opposite sides of the spectrum because I don't want to allude that one side is better than the other, but next we have Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, which is the first book we're getting from Orange since They're There, which continues to be incredibly popular. It was such a beautiful, important book. It has been a long time since I read There because I read it when it came out. So I will admit that I don't retain as much of that book as I would like to, but I remember it being a lot of narrative threads that wove together in a really beautiful way. And here I think we may be following a similar kind of style, and I do think there is a connection to There in this book. Here most specifically, I think we are following the kind of history and trauma of, at least in this narrative specifically, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So we're looking at that eradication of culture, the violence of that eradication of culture, the violence of these schools struggles outside of the cultural angle and how that has kind of passed through generations. And so this is an incredibly pertinent conversation. We're going to be moving throughout time in this novel. It is going to be dealing with some very heavy subject matter, but some very important subject matter. And Orange's writing, I don't know how to describe it this far removed from my reading experience of There, but there is just something incredible there. It's very poetic in a lot of ways, and I am very excited to get to experience that narrative style again. So I am kind of debating after hearing that or realizing that this connects in some ways to There, whether I need to go back to and revisit There, but I haven't decided yet. So if you have thoughts on how you're going to approach this book, let me know. I already have it on hold at the library, so I know I'm going to want to dive into it, but we'll see. And then we have Grief is for People by Sloane Crossley, which I believe is a memoir and is exploring the idea of grief outside of the kind of more trite stages of grief that are kind of commonly known. And so it seems like it's going to be diving into different explorations and ideas and understandings of grief through different mediums framed by the author's own loss. And I admit that I have been relatively privileged in my life in that I had been pretty removed from active, real biting grief until the last 5 years or so. And really the year before last, I dealt with grief much more immediately than I've had to previously. And so I could intellectualize about grief, but I didn't know what sitting in it looks like. To some degree, I'm still very privileged in that respect, but I'm very much interested in exploring that more actively, and just the idea that grief isn't a linear thing, that it can pop back up at surprising moments. So yeah, I'm probably just looking for a little bit more personal exploration and introspection from this book than from a lot of titles that I explore here, but maybe feeling part of something universal and bigger in that grief when grief itself can often feel so isolating. And then we have Kindling by Tracy Chee. I will admit that I'm way behind on Tracy Chee and have not read anything since The Reader, but I loved The Reader. I just needed to revisit it before reading the rest of the series and didn't circle back in time, and it's a whole big thing. But Kindling appears to be a standalone, at least so far, so I can jump back in. Could I have also jumped back in with 1,000 Steps Into Night? Yes, but I didn't, so here we are. Nevertheless, this book seems to involve a world that has recently outlawed kindling warfare, which involves elite teen soldiers with powers. And so now we have this group of former kindlings that are left adrift. I'm very interested in how the magic of this or the power of this is going to operate. Are these soldiers, do they basically have one shot? How does their power work? But in the wake of this and feeling lost and adrift, they come across a village that is under siege, which allows them to use their powers one last time. And this forces them to grapple with their past and their trauma in order to envision a future that is different and not mired in violence. And so this looks like it's going to be exploring some really heavy themes of war and trauma, and at its most benign, disillusionment, and then trying to enact a better future, whatever that looks like. So I don't really have a full sense of the shape of this. I'm very intrigued that it's a standalone and the idea of the tightness of the storytelling there. So we will see what we get. And then we have The American Daughters by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. This involves a young protagonist who becomes a part of a group of Black women who are spies to undermine the Confederacy. And honestly, that's it. That's the tweet. I'm very intrigued by the idea of this. The only other thing I've read somewhat in this realm is the Alyssa Cole Loyal League series, which is a romance series. And this is clearly not a romance, but either way, very intrigued by this. Also want to give a shout out because this is another cover I absolutely love this month. And then we have The Other Valley by Scott Alexander Howard, which on some levels seems like it's going to be an adult giver with the element of time, because our protagonist Odile is vying for a coveted seat on the council, though of course it's spelled weird because it's science fiction. And this council kind of overlooks the borders of their town because to one side it is 20 years in the past, and to the other side it is 20 years in the future. But things are complicated for Odile when a funeral procession for her best friend comes through that leads her to knowledge of what danger he may or may not be in and how immediate that otherwise she shouldn't. I presume that she has this information or is privy to this based on her closeness to this position on the council. And while this makes her a frontrunner for this highly coveted position she's been vying for, she finds herself getting closer to this potentially ultimately doomed boy and kind of having to figure out what this means for the both of them. And what does the future look like in a world where the future is already just one town over? So I definitely think this is going to be exploring ideas of free will, but also dimensions. And like, are these towns just different dimensions? Are they different versions of dimensions? Like, is that a different choice than is being made in this contemporary timeline? I don't know. I'm fascinated by the idea of time in fiction, so I'm very interested to see how it's handled here. Additionally, while this is science fiction and speculative, it also does seem like it is very much living in a literary realm as well, so I'm very interested to see what the tone of this is going to be. It feels, at least according to the blurb, like it might be somewhat serious, but at the same time, council is spelled kind of silly, so maybe not. I don't know. We'll see, but very much a unique, intriguing concept for sure, at least in my book. And then we have Murmur by Cameron Burnett, which is a poetry collection. I definitely want to try to be better about reading poetry this year, especially after the Goodreads snubs last year. But I also was very much drawn in by the cover of this. And according to the blurb, this collection is an exploration of what it means to be a Black man in contemporary America. And additionally, the lens through which we're exploring that, which I'm going to read from the blurb, is particularly interesting to me. It says, navigating personal experiences, political hypocrisies, pop culture, social history, astronomy, and language. And so I think that's a very interesting convergence of ideas and lenses through which to explore this, and I'm very excited to see what this looks like. I have loved poetry, particularly from Saeed Jones in the last couple years, so very interested to continue branching out in my poetry explorations. And then we have a short story collection, My Documents by Alejandro Zambra. I will admit that the translator Megan McDowell definitely flagged this for me, because Megan McDowell has translated some of my favorite short stories, and my favorite short stories in translation for sure, in Mariana Enriquez and Samantha Schweblin. So I am very interested to see what other work she is translating. I do believe this is Chilean literature, which I'm not sure I have any experience with, shamefully, and I don't know that it's going to have the same dark, edgy tones as your Mariana Enriquez or your Samantha Schweblin, but I am very interested to see if the odd still bleeds in here in some ways, what the form looks like. The blurb does use uncanny in its description, so we will have to circle back to unpack what context that is being used in. And then finally, we have Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. This is a young adult fantasy that lives in that fairy tale-esque realm, according to what I can glean from the blurb. And in a world where magic is outlawed and considered monstrous, our protagonist unleashes her own powers with devastating consequences. Unclear if that was a purposeful unleashing or not. And in this, she is caught by what is described as the demon warden of the wood, who offers her a bargain, 1 year of servitude in exchange for a wish. And so this definitely seemingly has elements of Beauty and the Beast in that description. And additionally, the blurb says, or ends, I should say, those who enter the wood do not always return. And I love a more complicated wood. I love a liminal space. I love the darkness of the woods and the fairy tale-esque nature of the woods. So intrigued by that, combined with the presumably Beauty and the Beast angle. And with that, that is all of February, which I know I've been sitting here talking at you for a second, and if you're still here, I very much appreciate it. Again, go ahead and let me know what you're excited about for the month, whether we've talked about it here or not. Also, if any of these books pique your interest in terms of a more in-depth Feature Friday discussion, let me know that as well. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts about books. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet and you feel like it. Most importantly, as always, read something good, and yeah, bye.